Hi everyone, my name is Gruia Bădescu. I'm a Humboldt Fellow at the University of Konstanz, where I'm part of the Reconstructing Memory in the City project. My broader work is on the connections between architecture, place, space, and memory, and I'm interested in places with a difficult past, including post-war cities and their reconstruction, but also dealing with political violence after dictatorships. And I'm going to talk today about the latter. That is the work I've done as part of an international Franco-British project, which concerned Europe, including Central and Eastern Europe, and Latin America. I'm going to first briefly introduce the broader project, and then I will talk about my own work on sites of memory, which actually connect with the broader discussion we have here. So the research I will talk to you today is part of this project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the United Kingdom and also the l'ABEX Les Passés dans le Présent of France. Its principal investigators were James Mark from Exeter and Frédéric Zalewski from Paris. So the project links countries that were described by these so-called transitologists as part of a third wave of democratization. That means that countries emerging from military dictatorships in Latin America or in Southern Europe, but also the socialist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, but also Central Asia. One of the main drivers of the project is the interest in criminalization of the past. So how past regimes of dictatorship are being criminalized through the work of multiple professions. So be it the work of the judicial sector, of truth commissions, but also the work of historians through new historiographies, as well as through different forms of bottom-up mobilizations of victims associations, of human rights groups. Finally, the heritage of dictatorships, as well as the use of sites associated with political violence to memorialize and therefore to tell the story of the crimes of the past regime, is a very important aspect. The second driver of this project was actually to understand the entanglements and circulations between these two regions, between the Latin American case and various situations in Europe, including post-socialist Europe. So the project has focused on linking the two regions, not in just a comparative framework, but on in global entanglements and circulations. So building on the work on transnational advocacy networks, but also on the work on the influence of the Latin American model, the so-called Pinochet effect, but also on the transnational activism of Eastern European memory entrepreneurs. If you want to hear more about the results of the project, I recommend you the two special collections, one on entanglements in justice and memory between Europe and South America, and the other one is on the crisis of memory. As well as, if you speak French, there's actually a book project called Condamner le Passé, which is also intended for educational purposes. Within the team, I had the pleasure to work on heritage issues with Nelly Beckus, an expert on memorial sites in the former Soviet Union. Together with Nelly Beckus and with Raluca Grosescu, we collaborated to organize a series of events which bridged research with practice as part of our collaboration with the ICMIMO branch of ICOM. ICOM is the International Council of Museums. So we organized a number of events, of meetings, and of workshops in Milan, in Bucharest, which brought together research and practitioners. In our work, we dealt both with the architectural legacies of dictatorial regimes, as well as with sites associated with political violence. So here, the center point of our interest was how ideas and approaches circulated between contexts, as well as how actors were entangled throughout different scales. With regards to the post-Soviet space, here's some of the work that Nelly Beckus has done on these issues. Now, let me focus on my research on sites of memory in Central and Eastern Europe and in the southern corner of Latin America, in which I was looking at, on the one hand, regional regimes of constituting sites of memory, but also possible circulations within them and between them. There has been a lot of attention on transnational memory and also of how memory travels. Astrid L. theorized traveling memory, referring to contexts, to forms, practices, and as well as carriers. And what I will do now is I will have a look at the broader processes and practices that we see in the two regions in order to highlight also comparative and transnational possibilities of dialogue. And I will start with the what, in which I put together both the contents and the practices of memorialization. One important aspect of transnational circulations is the increase in the practice of memorialization itself. So we see a global expansion of memorials, of memory museums, of sites of memory. The aftermath of the end of both military regimes in Latin America, as well as socialist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, We see an attention towards erecting memorials to the victims of dictatorship. You can see them in most Chilean and Argentinian cities, but also throughout Central and Eastern Europe. As the end of these dictatorships coincides with the so-called memory boom, or memory fever, as it's called by Elizabeth Jalin when talking about Latin America, we are seeing also the institution of the Memorial Museum that comes to the forefront. Some of the pioneers in this are the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago de Chile, but we see this typology of the Memory Museum also appearing in places like Lithuania, with the Museum of Genocide, or even the House of Terror in Budapest in Hungary. Some of these museums, particularly in the Central and Eastern European context, are related to events that took place in those buildings. So the choice for the building is that, and then they're being transformed into memorial museums. However, some of these sites of political violence are not transformed into museums per se, but become sites of memory. And this distinction is quite important, particularly in the Latin American case, where the difference is emphasized. That particularly victims associations, they say that we don't want museums, we want a site of memory where we connect with the memory of torture, executions, and detention. The act to memorialize such sites in both regions actually is connected with the memorialization of the Holocaust. It's part of this global memory regime that we have been talking about, in which the Holocaust is very important in inspiring action throughout the globe. And so, for instance, if you look at the former director of the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago, Ricardo Brodsky, he links Bachelet's idea to create a museum as a form of inspiration from the memorization of the Shoah. And many of the sites are connected through different individual agencies to the Holocaust. For instance, the Villa Grimaldi in Santiago de Chile has a quite complex history, which I explore in a book chapter, but in which I want to highlight that the architecture student that actually first worked on the project was quite influenced by her professor, a survivor of the Shoah, who manifested an important engagement and commitment to creating a site of memory in a time in the early 90s when in Chile such ideas were seen with quite skeptical eyes by the majority of the society. In Argentina, in particular, the connection with the Holocaust is important, as many of the victims of the last dictatorship were also Jewish. In this way, these connections between memory are quite important, as explored also by our team member Emilio Krenzel. In the Central Eastern European case, we see also a very direct impact of the Holocaust remembrance. If we just look at the Sighet Memorial Museum in Romania, Ana Blandiana, its co-founder, declared that the initiative started as an idea after her visiting Auschwitz in the early 1990s, when she started thinking that maybe it will be time to also dedicate to the victims of communism something that was already existing for the victims of fascism. This is also part of this broader discussion on the memory entrepreneurs who actually use the Holocaust repertoire to depict communist crimes, and this is a central debate also within the PoSoCoMeS memory group. However, if you look at the narratives of museums and also the exhibits in sites of memory, they're generally national. In most of the cases I studied, in both contexts, I saw that the focus is on the country's experience, usually with little reference to even neighboring countries or global issues, including the Cold War. There are, however, a number of limited sets of memory that actually refer to transnational practice of repression or to the victims of an entire region. So, for instance, the image here is from the Automotores Orleti in Buenos Aires, which deals with the detention and torture on site of prisoners brought there through a transnational operation called the Plan Condor, in which detainees came from Uruguay, Brazil, and other countries, Chile, of Latin America. And the transnational memorialization of this is, however, a bit lacking. And Central Eastern Europe, we see, for instance, the Gloria Victis Memorial in Hungary, which goes beyond the regional dimension and seeks even to commemorate 100 million victims of communism worldwide. It also includes examples of communist terror, as they call it, in Latin America, including crimes in Chile and Peru. And moreover, there are ongoing plans to build a museum of communism in Tallinn and Estonia, which, according to its ambassadors, will discuss the global dimension of the communist crimes. Now let us turn towards the where the geographies of remembrance. reference. And here I just want to make one point that there is a shift in the geography of heritage making. So from the fringe locations, be it within a country like the Siget, which is in the extreme north of Romania, to the scale of the city. If you look at places in Santiago de Chile, like Via Grimaldi, or Parque La Memoria in Buenos Aires, they are at the margin of the city. However, as memory becomes more central to societal debates, also centers of cities, centers of capital cities in particular, receive memorial museums, exhibits. For instance, in Bucharest, there's a offshoot of Siget to present in the center of Bucharest some of the exhibit in Siget. So we can see a shift in this geography. Let us now turn to the who, to the actors of site memorialization and to the carriers of these traveling forms. The memorialization of sites of political violence usually includes a constellation of actors who are mobilized for different reasons and interact to advance various agendas in connection or opposed to hierarchies of power. And I just listed them here. I wanted just to highlight that sometimes you have private actors, as in the case of Pitești, Romania, an infamous prison of the Pitești experiment, which actually became memorialized by the fact that the people who bought the space for offices in the 1990s had one family member who got very interested in the cause and decided to turn into a memorial without state support. Local communities and survivors usually play a role in advocating for creation of sites, but sometimes it happens that they participate in the design of sites themselves. One example of such participatory practices is the Memorial de Paine in Chile, where you had architects working together with survivors in various families who actually designed throughout a whole year process a way to for their family members to be remembered. This is a practice that's now circulating throughout the Latin American context, in which the idea is to empower also the survivors in the local community. Key in the circulation of practices across borders are the networks of practitioners. Some of them are localized. For instance, the Red Latinoamericana de Sitios de Conciencia, or in the Central and Eastern European case, there are a number of either informal or formal platforms in which practitioners meet. Also, at the global level, one can talk about the ICMIMO's role, but also the Federation of International Human Rights Museums and the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Sometimes individual agencies and encounters play a more important role than formal ones. For instance, in the case of Goliotok in Croatia, a complicated site which is associated with the memory of repression in the 1950s after the Stalin-Tito split, when Tito sent there a number of people he accused of being Stalinist. A place of amnesia during socialist Yugoslavia, in which in the 1990s state actors did not really want to deal with, as it didn't serve any platforms. Well, in this case, you had the activism of the Association of Survivors and Relatives, but a key central role in actually making the debates going to a vision for the memorization of the site came from the side of Documenta. Documenta is an important NGO in Croatia that deals with difficult pasts. It worked on the 1990s wars, but as its director told me, it's interesting. Golioto came from her 1990s trip to Chile and Argentina, where she was inspired by the determination of actors there in dealing with this kind of memory. So after doing a long battle on the 1990s memory in Croatia, she decided to also, given to this Latin American legacy, to also deal with this rather neglected site in Croatia. The transnational entanglements also have to do with the presence of diasporic communities. For instance, in the south of Chile, in Punta Arenas, a large community that traces its origin to Croatia is also invoked in the way that the dictatorship is being memorialized in the city. Let us now turn to the form and the design of such sites of memory. We're talking here about the global repertoire of memorial aesthetics. Some are connected with Maya Lin's work on Vietnam Memorial or Peter Eisenman's memorial in Berlin, both emblematic for how memorial architecture looks like. And they both are invoked by many of my architect interlocutors in the way they designed memorials throughout the two regions. Yet what I'm more interested in is what kind of regional models exist and how do they circulate within the regions. So in the case of Latin America, a dominant approach aimed to preserve an authentic space of memory, quote unquote, is this what I call the bare walls approach. This is based on the archaeological tradition to preserve authenticity, and it's related to the concern for forensics and exhibiting proofs. In the Latin American context, the disappearing of most witnesses of torture and detention left the walls as a kind of silent witnesses, that the associations of survivors insist that it should stay like this, in a form of arrested decay in which we don't intervene and we let the walls speak about the pain that happened in these sites. Any attempts to modify, as some of the architects I interviewed would tell me, are usually met with consternation and with opposition from the victims associations groups. If we are to go into the Central Eastern European regional model, so to speak, we see that in memorial museums here, there's an attention, on the contrary, to bringing as much there as possible with interactive forms of display, multimedia installations. The museums somehow are explosive in a sense of stimulating all senses. For instance, Maria Schmidt and her team, who curated the House of Team in Budapest, they visited and found inspiration museums in the Baltic countries as well as in Germany. So they developed this mode of display which has symbolism, sound effects, and lighting with a desired emotional impact. And this traveled further through the region, as Schmidt actually consulted a variety of new museum initiatives, including in Warsaw, in Bucharest, and in Kiev. Well, we see that these multimedia display installations were also used in Argentina, in the case of ESMA, a very important site there. But there they are intended to bring only some extra information and keep the bare walls. So they just, in fact, like this, they don't depart from the regional model. Design questions remain at the core of many debates about these sites. For instance, should one rebuild the site of political violence when it was destroyed, like in the case of Via Grimaldi? The resistance to transform such places is more, as we have seen, a Latin American pattern. Another thing that happens in both regions is the dilemmas whether sites of memory are places of displaying memory and victims' remembrance, or they should be spaces of political and social action. In the Latin American case is more pronounced with leftist activities happening in places like Londres 38 in Santiago, but also this is happening also in case of Romania, where you see discussions on around the Pitești Memorial. The question here is also how this politicization of sites of memory occurs in deeply domestic context, or is actually circulating as well. And in this situation, the dialogue between Latin America and Southern Cone in particular, and Central Eastern Europe needs to continue, and we need to see the ways in which these regions engage. If you'd like to see more in detail and to see actually the outcomes of the discussion in particular sites in the regions, I recommend two of my recent articles and chapters, which are talking about this entangled nature between Latin American and Southern Cone and Central Eastern Europe. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I look very forward to the discussion at the Roundtable.